India's Prime Minister visits Washington. What does it mean for India-U.S. relations? Hello, I'm Anil, and this is The Heat. The White House has given a warm welcome to India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi on his state visit to Washington, D.C. He met with U.S. President Biden on Thursday, and both leaders outlined areas where the two countries are making progress, including their economic relationship. Prime Minister Modi also addressed a joint session of the United States Congress. We begin with CGTN's White House correspondent Nathan King. And Nathan, what were the big issues on the agenda, and what do you think the visit is accomplishing?
Well, in all spheres, both diplomatic, militarily, economically, it's obvious that the US is trying to pull India closer into its orbit. The unanswered question is how far India will move that way. But it is a dramatic visit. Remember, this is the only third state visit by a leader, even though he's not India's president, he's the Prime Minister of the Biden administration after ROK's Yoon and France's Macron. He's also addressed a joint session of Congress. That's the second time he's done that, and the red carpet really is thick for him. They're having a banquet now, state dinner, right on the South Lawn, beautiful saffron, everything laid out. So, you know, they really have gone the extra mile here to make Modi feel welcome. And if you look into the detail of what they've decided, essentially a lot of it is economic. Now, as you know, the US wants to diversify its supply chains. It stopped the word decoupling from China, but de-risking is there. And there's three big semiconductor announcements from Lam Research, Micron, and we know about its experiences in China and the controversy there, and Applied Materials as well. Investments, but also training, technology sharing, and in the defense realm as well, which is quite incredible considering that India still buys the majority of its stuff from Russia, and generally the US penalizes countries that do that. There is a big jump. It's going to be making General Electric jet engines, so the technology transfer is something apparently even Japan doesn't get, according to the White House. Drones as well. Looks like they're going to be signed off on. These controversially could be used in the India-China border dispute. So there's a lot of that, and more and more meshing of training, for example. Even US ships will be allowed to be fixed in Indian shipyards. So there's all that, and then on top of that, more and more cooperation when it comes to space, AI, etc., etc. The one thing we didn't hear about is human rights. As you know, Joe Biden says he's going to put human rights at the heart of his foreign policy, but I can tell you, the US really thinking with their head here, and really trying to flatter India as now the world's largest country by population. It's a democracy like the US, Biden emphasized, while trying to draw a distinction with China. But as the US flatters India, as I said before, it's now a member of the Quad, for example, which has been reinvigorated with Australia and Japan. But will it be pulled more into the US orbit, considering India has a tradition of non-alignment, even though it has problems with China? They think similar ways about the global South. So it's going to be very interesting to see the deliverables of this visit and how they play out over time. But I can tell you the full flattery for Narendra Modi has been going on in the US for about 48 hours now.
Thanks, Nathan. That's CGTN's Nathan King reporting to us from the White House.
Appreciate it.
And now for much more on all of this, joining me now is Sourabh Gupta. He is the Senior Asia-Pacific Policy Specialist at the Institute for China-America Studies. Also with us is Anil Gupta. He is the Chair in Strategy, Globalization and Entrepreneurship at the University of Maryland. Joining the discussion too is Anthony Moretti. He is Associate Professor at Robert Morris University. And we are joined too by Andy Mock. He is a Senior Research Fellow at the Center for China and Globalization. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Sourabh Gupta, Prime Minister Modi was very positive when he appeared with President Biden at a joint news conference at the White House. Let's listen to what the Indian Prime Minister had to say.
Today is a day that has special importance in the history of India-America relations. Our discussions today and the important decisions we have taken have added a new chapter to our comprehensive and a global strategic partnership. They have given it a new direction and a new energy.
So, Sourabh, put this in context for us. How substantive is this visit, and why is the U.S. now pursuing better relations with India? Let's not forget that it wasn't so long ago that this Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, was denied a visa to come to the United States. He was quite literally banned from coming here.
This is an important visit. I won't say it's a transformative visit, but the deliverables coming out of the visit are very substantial, and one must recognize that. US-India relations for the past decade or two have been moving on a good path, of course, politically at the macro level, but their deepest progress has been in the defense cooperation area. This meeting has set a standard or a new starting point, if one would say, or as Mr. Modi himself said, a new chapter in broadening that defense relationship into a defense industrial cooperation relationship, and so thereby lock down that defense cooperation in a much more significant way. You heard that about Nathan talking about co-production in India of technologies like jet engine technologies and sales like the for the drones to India. And over and above all the defense technological cooperation and deepening, there's also been, for the first time, I would say, a real effort to deepen the critical and emerging technologies or advanced technologies cooperation. Now, how far this will go, that will depend, frankly, on India if it can get its act right on this front. Manufacturing has not been a strength in India, and so there are limits to how much this cooperation can be realized. But the aim is to bring science and technology cooperation into to broaden it out in terms of, as you saw, in the area of semiconductors, but also another important deliverable in terms of space, civilian commercial space exploration. India joining the Artemis framework is an important one because that framework is not exactly grounded in UN rules. It's kind of a little a la carte set up by the US, but it has great investment made by the US in Artemis, and India is finally signing on to it. So the point being, the relationship has gone from just a real defense cooperation to defense industrial base cooperation to high technology cooperation in larger civilian commercial sectors. And we'll see how far that can be realized. And that will come down, and frankly, if India can do what it needs to do at its part to become a manufacturing power, at least, not a superpower, but at least a power, at least. So that's important. You know, one last point you talked about, he's being embraced now, the man who was in the US's bad books. But the fact of the matter is, as soon as he came into power, and that was during Barack Obama's administration, he was mainstreamed, and I think Mr. Obama went down to India in 2015, attended the Republic Day celebrations. So that has been long-standing, even though these are democratic presidents.
Yeah.
From a ex-democratic president itself, Mr. Modi has been mainstreamed, and of course, Mr. Trump didn't care too much on that front. And so I don't see this as being something new or novel in what Mr. Biden has done, even though he talks about human rights, et cetera, et cetera.
Anil Gupta, great to have you with us on the show. The Indian Prime Minister also noted the growing economic relationship between India and the United States. Let's listen to a bit more of what he had to say on that issue.
Today, America is India's biggest trade partner. We have decided to resolve long pending trade-related issues and make a new beginning.
So, Anil, what is your assessment of this economic relationship and that announcement that Indian companies will invest pretty heavily in the United States?
Yeah. So I think, obviously, I mean, as the media, in some ways, rightly, but I would only say in some ways says that Mr. Modi's visit to the U.S. and all the burgeoning of U.S.-India relationship, that a big factor in this is China. But I would qualify that a bit, certainly on the economic front, if not the defense front. And that is because the China factor on the economic front and US India trade relationship, investment relationship, that's just the icing, because the cake really is what is happening in India and what's happening globally. Because if you look at, obviously, US is now India's largest trading partner. And now, why is that? Because see, the trade between India and China is all about goods, and China is a much stronger manufacturing power. So China exports a lot more to India than India does to China. On the other hand, India is a massive exporter of digital services to the US. And so therefore, that relationship, the US-India relationship is different. Now, if you just look at what's happening around the world, that every function in every company, and certainly every American company, is getting digitized. As that happens, a country like India, with its very large pool of very strong talent, is sitting basically in the catbird seat. And just to give you and this is obviously no longer, the low-cost, call centers of 20 years back, that JP Morgan, for example, the largest American bank, the largest Western bank, has 250,000 people employed globally. Out of those, 50,000 are sitting in India. And JP Morgan doesn't have much market operations in India. So those 50,000 are largely in the service of JP Morgan's Western operations, primarily US operations. So that's just an indicator. And those are not call center people. Those are, data science people, AI people, and the like. And that story only gets better, number one. Number two, on the manufacturing front, that Mr. Modi, that one of the things he has been pushing with gusto, with passion, is India's infrastructure. And here I mean the physical infrastructure. Obviously, there is the digital infrastructure, but the physical infrastructure, the way it has been playing out over the last 10 years, India has not seen anything like that before. And so, but then you add to that another factor that as India becomes a larger and larger economy, the size of the domestic market, for example, for electronic goods, becomes larger. And of course, India is, along with China, the largest market for smartphones. So therefore, if you're a Samsung, if you're an Apple, if you're a Xiaomi, and you want to sell smartphones in India, you have no choice but to manufacture in India. And that's what Xiaomi does, and that's what Apple has now started doing. So it's only partly about diversifying the supply chain away from China. It's much more about how do you serve India's domestic market, which is now becoming very large. And in another 5 years, it'll be massive. But then what happens is that once you manufacture at large scale in India for the Indian market, and given the physical infrastructure push that Mr. Modi has been making, then of course you have all the setup is perfect to start exporting. Already, in fact, Apple, the iPhones that it manufactures in India, it has already started exporting from India. So as Apple's manufacturing footprint in India, obviously working with Foxconn and others, grows, India's electronics exports will grow. So I think in terms, and obviously US is going to be a huge market. So I think this relationship between US and India, roughly about $195 billion worth of bilateral trade in goods and services for 2022. I wouldn't, rule it out that within 5 years, that could touch 400 billion.
All right. Anthony Moretti, not surprisingly, President Biden was also very upbeat and positive about the visit. Let's listen to what he had to say.
Together, we're unlocking a shared future of what I believe to be unlimited potential. And with this visit, we're demonstrating once more how India and the United States are collaborating on nearly every human endeavor and delivering progress across the board.
So both sides very positive, very upbeat, Anthony. But in the wider scheme of things, what does it really change?
Short term, I'm not sure how much it's really going to change. I do agree that long term is perhaps the playbook that both countries and both leaders are looking at. But there are a couple of things I think that have struck me in listening to the language that both leaders have used in the last couple of days. Number one, it sounds awfully like what the Chinese talk about when they talk about win-win collaborations. That neither man used that phrase today, but if you think about it, the U.S. is speaking about the benefits that it can provide India. India is providing or explaining the benefits it can provide the United States. Nowhere do you see the differences, especially relating to human rights, or at least the perception of the differences of human rights, which I'll explain in just a second. Instead, you see this notion of, hey, we're the two largest democracies. We're obviously going to work together. Everything's going to be great. And then you have the issue that came up when one of the Wall Street Journal reporters asked the Prime Minister today about human rights, and he deflected the question, seemed almost upset by that kind of question. So it's interesting to me how Washington will tell you that on one level, human rights is the core or at the core of what this administration wants to do, and yet it will do business with India, which again has the perception of a human rights problem, and maybe it does have a human rights problem. It will do business with Saudi Arabia, which clearly has a human rights issue and is not a democracy, but it will use both of those criticisms against China, not democratic, not human rights oriented, all of that. My point being that Washington wants to appear to have it both ways here, and I'm not sure how well that's going to go over. As we talked about just a few nights ago, 2024 election is coming up. Biden, I think, wants to generate some victories now, but whether they sustain themselves yet, we don't know.
Andy Mock, the Washington Post, of course, has been covering this extensively. One of its stories had this headline, and it said, Modi's visit sends a big, if quiet, signal to China. How is this visit being seen in China?
Well, I think certainly from the U.S. perspective, an important component of this is countering China, along with this rhetoric by President Biden of democracies versus autocracies. And I think it's important to point out, too, that the U.S. is, of course, willing to turn a blind eye, not only to some of these human rights concerns that it has about India, at least from the U.S. perspective, these are human rights concerns, to its stance on Russia, which is remarkable. But my concern here is that it might be much ado about nothing from the U.S. perspective, ultimately, in that the U.S., this is highly aspirational, and this might end in bitterness and disappointment for the United States in a parallel to China. So if we go back to the early days of quote-unquote engagement with China, the U.S. thought that it could change China into the vision of what it wanted it to be. And similarly today, the U.S. is showering India with priceless gifts, semiconductor technology, military jet technology, in the hope that India will become the ally, the friend that it wants. And there are very influential voices, just as there were early days of engagement, that China would be China, and similarly, India will be India. Ashley Tellis, for example, I think wrote a very interesting piece essentially saying that the U.S. would be disappointed in its hopes for India, because India, of course, is a large country, increasingly influential on the global stage, and extremely unlikely to go along with whatever the U.S. is looking for, despite, again, all the aspirational talk we're seeing today.
Sourabh Gupta, what do you make of what Andy told us about this relationship that the United States, as Andy points out, is showering India with high technology right now in the hope that India will perhaps be more like the United States?
No, I think Andy's got a point out there. India marches to the beat of its own drummer. That is going to stay. And in fact, this is not the first phase when we have had these sort of gifts showered on India. We had these gifts showered in the 50s and 60s when Mr. Eisenhower went to India, and Mr. Kennedy, he was also very, very pro-India at that point of time. and you know, the Indian nuclear program began with support. In nuclear program, India's space program began with the support of the United States, and things harder down the line. And so, I mean, nothing is given per se. But what I would say at this point of time is, regardless of what India turns out to be later, there is ample space for US, India to develop their relationship as two major players. India is not quite there. It's still 25 to 40 years away from being that sort of a major player. But there's ample space to, just as two major countries in the international system, deepen their relations without having to think of a third party, even though I know there's a lot of thinking among the two sides themselves about a certain third party. And that this will hold both sides in good stead down the line, even if their relationship doesn't move swimmingly, because at least there'll be greater, deeper people-to-people and business-to-business cooperation on both sides. And it's just in itself a good relationship to consolidate. And I would suggest, my view has always been, all the major powers need to have much better relationships with each other. And this is not us versus them, and let's gang up on this person and that person. That's not the recipe for a harmonious or a successful international system. But so far that India and the United States can work their differences out, incrementally cooperate, broaden the space for cooperation, I think, and is not necessarily very focused or directed on a third party, I think is by and large a win-win for the two countries and the system at large.
Anil Gupta, of course, India is the fifth largest economy in the world. It's also the most populous nation in the world right now. Question is, when we look at this relationship, is it an enduring relationship, or does it depend on the whims and security interests of the United States and the United States only?
So actually, it does not. And you know, if we go back to, for example, the human rights question that the media has, I think, made, in my view, a little too much of. And I do not mean to defend Mr. Modi at all. But you know, if I look at the U.S. relationships over the last several decades, the relationship with China, for example. So obviously, China is not a democratic country, certainly not democratic in the way the US sees it. But if there were not the geopolitical tensions with China regarding Taiwan, regarding South China Sea, East China Sea, if there were not the geopolitical tensions with China, the US and China relationship would be phenomenal right now, rather than the de-risking or the decoupling that's taking place. And it has nothing to do with the political system in China and the political system in the US. Look at what the US is doing in terms of cultivating Vietnam, what it did cultivating the treaty relationship with South Korea. It was a dictatorship for 30-odd years, more than 30 years. And so I think the media makes too much of the fact that somehow human rights are a factor. They're not. They have never been a big factor in US relationships with other countries. So that's number one. Number two, I think that the US and India, they do not have a geopolitical problem. They do not, obviously, even China and US do not have a direct geopolitical problem, but they do indirectly via South China Sea, via Taiwan. India and the US do not have a geopolitical problem. And so therefore, if India continues to become a stronger economy, and there is no reason to doubt that, and I'm not predicting that India will grow at 10% a year. All it has to do is keep growing at 7% a year. And compounding does its job. And so therefore already 2028, India is predicted by IMF to be the third largest economy after US and China. And it will continue to be for quite some time the fastest growing economy in the world. So as India becomes a bigger economy, and is obviously there are no geopolitical tensions between US and India, either directly or indirectly, I wouldn't look at all at the human rights question or the political system question, irrespective of what happens in India. The US-India relationship will continue to thrive. The same reason why US-China relationship thrived, why US-South Korea relationship thrived.
Yeah. All right, let me get Andy Mock's view on this. Andy Mock, what do you make of that distinction that Anil Gupta makes, that the United States has geopolitical tensions with China, and that's what makes it different from its relationship with India?
Well, I would say, Anand, that in fact, it is precisely the geopolitical tension and rivalry between China and the United States that is benefiting not just India, but countries in Africa, the nations in the Pacific. Because we have to remember that the U.S., partly because of the structure of its political system, tends to be erratic in terms of its foreign policy priorities. And I think most reasonable people would agree that without this sense of threat from China, India would probably be a little bit more of an afterthought, as Africa and as the Pacific nations have been. But it is exactly because the U.S. feels threatened that it is seeing China's diplomatic successes around the world, in the Middle East, with Iran and Saudi Arabia, with the Honduras, that it feels it has to do something. And India is a beneficiary of that. And I think it knows this, too, that the U.S. is looking to be its most ardent suitor today. Year or 2 years from now, it may be a very different picture.
Okay, Anthony Moretti, I've just got a little bit of time left, just under a minute. Peace and security also on the agenda during this visit. And of course, the two sides talked about the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. India, of course, has its own independent course on this issue. And Prime Minister Modi also has a good relationship with the Russian President, Vladimir Putin. But looking at that, I mean, is this where Modi could have perhaps some influence with the United States?
Perhaps I'm skeptical. I confess that I'm skeptical in that way. And what I mean by that is that the United States position regarding Ukraine and Russia seems so significantly baked in at this point, especially when you think about the weapon sales and Western Europe, I think to some extent is engaged in this as well. Well, is engaged in this, but not to the degree perhaps that the United States is. So I don't know if there's necessarily going to be an opportunity to influence U.S. thinking at this point. Could it moderate U.S. thinking? Maybe, but now perhaps, we're talking a little bit of semantics. My thought is, as you look to the potential for India in 10, 15, 20 years, do we suddenly see it become China? And what I mean by that is anybody that gets too close to the apex suddenly stops being ally, friend, good guy. I wonder if that happens down the line, but obviously not something we can determine tonight.
Okay, we are going to have to leave it there. Time has caught up with us. Thanks to all of you for being with us. I'm Anil in Washington, D.C.